As you can see, the lecture, I was going to preface it by 2 remarks. The first thing is the lecture was actually given, this is the context, to a 3rd year class, the last lecture of a course called Critical Debates, which is an English program. It's called the Capstone subject. So the lecture will have a bit of that flavour to it, that sort of address, I guess, a bit pedagogical in places and so on. A bit didactic. I've tried to take as much of that out as I can, but it's still actually there. So that's the context of the lecture. I guess the other thing I want to say is that in some senses what informs it is, I guess, the research work that I've tried to do, which is actually trying to look for a concept of education, rather than to think about, in its generally thought about utilitarian terms, how we can make this better or that better, or change this or change that, or reform this or reform that. It's not really what I'm interested in. Even if I'm interested, I'm not even sure I'm interested in this at all, but this is what I've been doing, is trying to work out a concept for education. The idea is that if, I guess it's a philosophical conceit in some ways, if you can give it a concept that in some way you can sort of insulate it from all those utilitarian and pragmatic uses it's put to all the time. It's not going to actually stop all that, but I guess the idea is that if you can provide it with a concept, then at least it's a point of orientation which all attempts to do something in the name of education have to, or can be measured against something like that. I guess it's an ancient philosophical conceit that somehow you can do that. I guess the Republic is like that. Here's a good city, right? But we're yet to see it. So I've got the slideshow which I'm going to run through just for some images to look at, which I made for that lecture, and it's going to accompany it. So I'll just get straight into it. It's called What Good and Untrue Education, Some Remarks on the University and its Capstone. Okay. So anyone familiar with Derrida will know that promises and threats are a matter of context. Unlike John R. Searle Inc., I cannot control iteration, so you will decide what this turns out to be. I had a bit of a fancy for institutional terms, the function of names, the intentions they presume to transmit, even if it's often a lack of intention they transmit, the normative force of such terms, and the ideological conditions of such terms. It would seem to me that in an educational institution, if that is not an oxymoron, and truly it must not be, to think through the names is not a bad idea, especially if one presumes themselves to be educated. And perhaps this term education is the one we should be thinking about most of all, if we were to be critical. In 1795, when the French Revolution had gone over to the other side of reaction and restoration, the Marquis de Sade wrote a tract extolling his fellow countrymen. Frenchman, one more effort please if you would become Republican. Sade offered a new radicality to what it meant to become Republican, to follow this desire right to the end. Without this, he declared, the real murderers and thieves, the state and the wealthy, would keep on getting away with it. So, faced with a situation in which the well-schooled brigands are still in triumph, and that getting away with it is the default setting, I invoked Sade and asked, one more effort, everyone, if we would become educated. My earlier talk on this subject of critical debates was positive. I was selling a course, the importance of debates, their critical necessity for the good life, and so on. Today, things are a little different. I'm going to be flippant, make a few puns, some jokes, poke fun, provoke, and generally be elusive. Am I serious? And this is where you come in. Knowing that you're all so well schooled in theory, I have no need to be didactic or demonstrative. Your job today, as if you were butterfly collectors, is to catch the illusions. So my talk is modelled in a very casual way on what the situationists call a détournement. Not for the last time, I quote Wikipedia. A détournement is a variation on a previous media work in which the newly created one has a meaning that is antagonistic or antithetical to the original. The original media work, that is détourned, must be somewhat familiar to the target audience so that it can appreciate the opposition of the new message. A détournement is a technique developed in the 50s by the Lettrist International and consists in turning expressions, in this case, of the capitalist system against itself, like turning slogans and logos against the advertisers of the political status quo. Reductively, a détournement, a contingent linking of the disparate, creates a situation or a moment, one that is parallel, yet newly withdrawn from the spectacle. The key figure in the SI, or the Situationist International, of course, was Guy Debord, author most famously of the Society of the Spectacle, whose main thesis, to quote Debord, from his comments on the Society of the Spectacle, written 20 years later, show that the spectacle was in essence the autocratic reign of the market, acceded to an irresponsible sovereignty, and the totality of new techniques of government which accompanies this reign. From this, the argument goes, we need a detour, a new recuperation or reconfiguration of the disparate parts, rendered partial, and importantly, a detour that traces out the really or truly new as distinct from the debased novelty that the market serves up year in, year out, and in the service of its continuing. The situationists took the idea of the detour, which is already in Plato, from Walter Benjamin's development of Baudelaire's depiction of the flaneur. The flaneur traversed the Parisian cityscape, domesticated by Haussmann's architectural, Napoleonic imperialism, on the lookout for the reality of the lived experience amidst the ordinary repetitions of commerce and work. For Benjamin, the flaneur is the artist of divergence, ever on the threshold between worlds, marking out a trace of something new. For Benjamin, consumerism was the death of Baudelaire's flaneur, but there you have it. So I give my talk this literary and theoretical pedigree to veil the fact that I've made it all up. Basically, I am riffing wildly on the sense of capstone found in educational literature, and I'm reconfiguring it anew, but I do it by way of a detour. So let me, with all conceit intended, quote the board just one more time. Our unfortunate times thus compel me, once again, to write in a new way. Some elements will be intentionally omitted, and the plan will have to remain rather unclear. Readers will encounter certain decoys, like the very hallmark of the era. As long as certain pages are interpolated here and there, the overall meaning may appear. Just as secret clauses have very often been added to whatever treaties may openly stipulate, just as some chemical agents only reveal their hidden properties when they are combined with others. However, in this brief work, there will be only too many things which are, alas, easy to understand. My quaint old Oxford dictionary does not have an entry for capstone. It jumps from capstan, which is a vertical axle rotating machine developed for use on sailing ships to apply force to ropes, cables and hawsers. The word, connected with the old French capstan or cabestant, from Old Provençal, cabestan, from capesta, pulley cord, from Latin capestrum, a halter, from capere, to take hold of, to capsule, which is, this is the first entry, a membranous envelope. And the second is a dry seed case opening when ripe by parting of valves. You get the picture, halter, envelope, ripening machine. Wikipedia sends you to coping, as in architecture, which is not completely outside the frame, as the idea there is to cap or cover a wall in such a fashion that the weather doesn't get in. In this sense, then, it's about keeping something constructed such that it's in from being corrupted by something without, and the coping stone, often a decorative feature in itself, even has the decency to carry away that which seeks to penetrate into the newly capped construction to where it will be rendered no further nuisance. The capstone, then, is most certainly no accident. It is integral to the edifice, or at least to an edifice constructed in such a way that it then needs capping. A capstone is an imminent demand of the edifice itself, a self-referential entity that refuses to submit to the weather out there, and instead blocks itself against it in order to maintain its integrity. It's the end of the poem. In following the hyperlinks so conveniently set out for me on Wikipedia, such that I feel myself the agent of my own literary journey, narrator and constructor at once of my own special world, of course, as those smoking ads say, every keystroke is doing you damage. I came across this explanation. Coping or scribing is the woodworking technique of shaping the end of a moulding or frame component to fit the contours of an abutting member. I missed a couple of slides. Sorry. I'll say it again. If we cut a couple of words, it's instructive. No. If we cut a couple of words, it's instructive. Coping or scribing is the technique of shaping the end to fit the contours of an abutting member. I have to say I like the word abutting. It suggests all kinds of things, and abutting a member is just too much. But given our educational context, indeed our academic one, listen to this from Socrates in Plato's Dialogues, the Charmides. He did come, and his coming caused a lot of laughter, because every one of us who was already seated began pushing hard at his neighbour, so as to make a place for him to sit down. In the end, he came and sat down between me and Critias. And then, my friend, I really was in difficulties. And although I had thought it would be perfectly easy to talk to him, I found my previous brash confidence quite gone. And when he turned his full gaze upon me in a manner beyond description, and seemed on the point of asking a question, and when everyone in the palace just surged all around us in a circle, my noble friend, I saw inside his cloak and caught on fire, and was quite beside myself. Polite psychoanalysts will call this admixture of knowledge and desire transference. Rude Greeks will call it abutment. Interestingly, capstone is also the term used to describe the fossil echinus, or sea urchin, which inhabits a spheroidal shell. It is of the genus Cannulus. Cannulus provides the root for the word cannula, which is defined as a small tube for inserting into a cavity. In a curious novel called Rudiments of Mineralogy, I found this. There are also quoit, boat, buckler or shield urchins, which you may meet in your search. They are at least to be seen in the museum. Some are only cast in flint, the outer shell having disappeared. The interior is filled with flint. The common capstone echinus is usually in this state. Let's note in passing that urchin is a derogatory name for the children of the poor, who spend their days out and about on the street participating in what one might call knowledge transfer. Under the never patronising tutelage of UNESCO and its humanitarian capping intervention on what it calls low development capacity countries, we can rest assured a well-meaning pedagogue will catch up with every species of urchin still out there. Anyway, coping and scribing. Scribing is basically marking out a piece of wood or stone or sheet metal, etc., to the shape or the formation of the abutting member. Obviously, one then cuts along that inscription so that what was inscribed on the material body is reactualised vis-à-vis the demands of the abutting member. Retrospectively, we could think of the inscription as a virtual cut, which a good abutment actualises. It's impressive how the abutting wall, the dominant or structuring structure, is in no structural way disturbed by the abuttee. The latter, it turns out, must have been inscribed such that it attend to the needs and demands of the original structure, lest it either be unstable in its position vis-à-vis structure or at fault for letting in the weather. As none of us want to be accused of threatening the integrity of the structure, which we so solemnly and learnedly abut, let alone be characterised as unstable, or it's off to the imaging machine and some solid CBT, it is best, is it not, that we pursue our scribing and coping with all due diligence and with a weather eye to the good order it convenes. Digging about further among the things of shadow and light, I discovered without surprise that capstone is a particularly popular term in educational institutions. Everyone nowadays has a capstone this or that, and they are generally referred to as, wait for it, capstone experiences. They are, it is said, varied. Which? The capstone or the experiences? They never tell you these things. But anyway, they say, may be grouped as, experiences that illustrate a student's skill development and experiences that broaden a student's understanding of the work environment and the societies and economies with which they will engage and contribute. As experiences, they are something one undergoes or endures, like an abutment. The character of the experience, emotional, intelligible, painful, pleasurable, cognitive, demonstrative, etc. are, I suppose, matters for the individual. And yet, as we can see, this is not a matter of contingency or chance. Already the experience, according to the above, is a strictly delimited, experience. You know precisely what the experience will be, the form it will take, and thus what an experience is. Once upon a time, the word experience also meant to experiment. One subjected oneself to the possibility that something new might be possible. For the subject in the world, and even for the very form of subjectivity, experiments require hypotheses and speculation and work under the shadow of the impossible. If one is truly to have a capstone experience, the possibility of the stone not appearing as a cap would have to be included as a variable in the experiment. Otherwise, it would not be all it might be, even if it might be all it should. But as is well known, science is very annoying. It often threatens to reveal the con in contribute and the gag in engagement, messing up the right of everyone to their proper capstone experience. When searching the internet, this in particular caught my attention. a chap called Joseph Cuseo had constructed a rubric of the capstone. People really do lead interesting lives. Letting my ressentiment shine, I can imagine this was well funded by the US equivalent of the ARC. Anyway, if we look closely, the rubric combines bodies, inscriptions and abutment and is driven by an architecture that pre-establishes or presupposes the coherence of the whole. In newspeak, pre-established results are called outcomes. Promotion of the coherence and relevance of general education, promotion of integration and connections between general education and the academic major, fostering an integration and synthesis within the academic major, promotion of meaningful connections between the academic major and work and career experiences, explicit and intentional development of important student skills, competencies and perspectives that are tacitly or incidentally developed in the college curriculum. Enhanced awareness of and support for the key personal adjustments encountered by seniors during their transition from college to post-college life. I really think it's important to read every word. Improvement of seniors' career preparation and pre-professional development, that is, facilitation of the transition from the academic to the professional world. Enhancement of seniors' preparation and prospects for postgraduate education. We know where that leads. Promotion of effective life planning and decision making with respect to practical issues likely to be encountered in adult life after college. For example, financial planning, marriage and family planning. I also found the following in a document from the university website. It's taken from a guy called Howard Gardner, a constructivist pedagogue any education student out there will know of. He is the guy who invented the notion of multiple intelligences, which, when I think about it, has a certain Bourdieuian smell about it, as Nietzsche would say. And no doubt Rancière would have some harsh words for this effort to enlighten the populace, or as Allen Ginsberg said, to do the worm on the Acropolis and slam dance Cosmopolis. Who knows where that's from? Yeah. Well-educated audience. Right. So, Mr. Gardner. As you can see, it runs a similar game to Professor Cuseo, but its contemporary piety seems even more explicit. Capstone experiences can be designed to address connecting discipline-specific curriculum to general education objectives, assisting students to reflect on and demonstrate that they have learnt over the course of their degree, relating discipline-specific learning outcomes to the world of work, providing a forum for students to participate in interdisciplinary activities, enabling students to reflect on and imagine personal, social, emotional and practical issues of transition beyond the university into the world of work, providing a bridge between final year of undergraduate degree and graduate programs and lifelong learning, directly engendering the development of graduate capabilities that employers are searching for in graduates, linking undergraduate students to employers and employment arenas, connecting graduates to alumni in their chosen fields, linking major subject students to another discipline, preparing graduates to become active alumni, i.e. give us money. It's all very pastoral, seamless, unproblematic, facilitating, positivist, conjunctural and fastidious. And if you know what I mean, American nice. In short, it's normative, which is to say it's a rubric for making normal. Not note making the normal, but making normal. Which, to use some more terms in fashion, is to say it's all very adaptive, flexible and resilient making. But to what? What are we supposed to adapt to, be flexible before, be resilient in the face of? I never find an explicit answer to this in any of the documents. But that's because it's really an ignorant question, and as such unworthy of a capstone subject. In the 50s, there was this breakaway psychoanalytic movement in the US, predominantly called ego psychology. They took up a particular, I say breakaway in inverted commas, I should say. They took up a particular strand of Freud. Adaptation became their watchword. Cuseo and Gardner, among many others who drive the contemporary pedagogical reflex, present within ego psychology's symptom. Jacques Lacan, the most prominent psychoanalyst of the late 20th century, hated this tendency. He asked the question, adapt to what? What is the subject's ego to be strengthened for? Lacan answers that it is set up to win the good housekeeping seal of approval, attesting to its suitability to the American way of life. This is in a creed. This was the 1950s, and you could centre these claims in America. Today, we would just say the globalised way of life, which is no less about good housekeeping, thus a sweet blend of economics and morality. It works like this. The analyst, the exemplar for the subject of normalcy, or the good American way of life, provides the subject with the model ego, to which, in the course of the treatment, the subject will come to identify, conform to, or more accurately, adapt. The ego of the analyst is merely a more or less strong representation of an exterior norm. Note that the norm is never in question, such as why my question is really dumb. What must always be adjusted, indeed by implication what can only be adjusted, is the subject. As you all know, the Melbourne model parodies with all seriousness an American one. On the slide, and the one before, I have marked out the always already determined outcome of this making normal. It's obviously the structure to which, suitably scribed and coped, we will be abutted, and upon which we will make no impression. So seamlessly fitted will we be into a schema that needs no introduction. I don't mean to sound cynical. After all, my goal is to ultimately identify the void or empty point of all this capstone normativity, and so identify the real point of education. But it would be wrong for us not to note the effect of structure on capping us off, of how the yeses and nos of something other than education seems to have consecrating power. No doubt we all, or most of us, need to make a living, to get a job, or as they say these days, a career, which is a word I really like because it can mean exactly not what it's supposed to mean. Definition 2 in my Oxford Dictionary says to go wildly. This is probably what the situationists meant when they said never work. But you'll have noticed that getting a job is not what's at issue in these copious lists anyway. Rather, it's about how one's education seems to be always already subject to a set of demands that obtain to the world as it is, to what we, or Badiou, might call the pedagogy of the world as it goes, or what Rancière calls, with less abstract beauty, stultification. Thus, education, it's supposed, says nothing about these demands or the place from which they issue. It would appear that our education has no effect on its place. There is a flow, an atonality, or a pointlessness to this education, as if its goal is to produce an incapacity or lack, precisely. On the one hand, nothing is left to chance, and on the other, it's all your own fault. The limit of this education is determined by what is not education to be off limits to it. It would be wrong to say that normativity is unconcerned with creativity and invention, but it would also be wrong to say that it is. Perhaps it's a matter of the link forged or not forged between idea and intensity. Provisionally, we can say this: the capstone caps something or other. We are not yet sure what. And this cap is a capping in stone, such that what is inscribed on the body is now set in stone. It's a message on a tablet, no less. The term capstone, in Castello's and Gardner's sense, names no less than a set of literal laws, the 9 and 11 commandments of pedagogy, if you like, of pedagogisation, to use Rancière's unlovely and unpronounceable word, given by the current lords of the earth. The Olympus of these lords, by the way, is not really Wall Street, Washington or Brussels, but Chicago, circa the 1950s. There we see the emergent power of neoliberalism, brute esotericism, or ego or constructivist psychology, and the self-interested version of the care of the self, all the component parts of contemporary pedagogy. As you Derridean, Butlerian and Gambinians know, this is because you are doing my course, terms are rarely innocent of intent, despite the immediate intentions of a speaker. That is to say, someone may utter a term in the course of their everyday conversation and not realise the force of the norm that the utterance carries. This is not to say the term is therefore free of normative and as such structuring and effective force. Indeed, the less speakers and hearers realise the normative effect of terms and discourses, the greater the normative effect can be. Of course, the relation between normativity and ideology is well marked. Suffice to say, paraphrasing Marx and the German ideology, that the norms of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling norms. And as such, terms are not innocent, nor are they accidents, and nor then are they predicated on that which is natural or essential or necessary, in some absolute sense, so much as on that which must continue to be. This is not to say ideology is a matter of opinion, rather it is the discourse, in this case words, images, rules and regulations, best fitted to smoothing over real contradictions, such that we can really believe they are not there at all. This belief, in fact, as Lacan noted, suits animals like us very well. Of course, what must continue to appear to be needs to be rebuilt every day, and to be rebuilt in such a way that the terms used to drive its construction maintain their utility and hence their effect. Mystification is what the board called this work. The fundamental need for the lack of consciousness. As with our capstone sea urchin, there is a vicious and barbed circularity in its makeup, coupled with an uncomfortably penetrative force. The use of terms in institutional contexts, and especially institutions purporting to be educational, is fraught because one expects, or at least one is led to believe, by force of the institution itself, by its mere existence, that norms correlate with truths. If one is to be educated, and I'll return to the tense of this word below, one would expect, given the correlation with truths, that this comes despite privilege, regardless of specificity, without partiality, and even independently of institutions. The latter, surely, should arise on the basis of the former. To confuse an effect for a cause is certainly poor science, but should one expect this? I'd say yes and no. No, because institutions, despite their sometimes ridiculous and desperate assertions to the contrary, although these are becoming rarer the deeper in the mire of conceit we sink, operate subject to the political logics of the time. There is some virtue in the fact that the pretense of the university being a special place, not like the real world, is being given up, but only insofar as to claim the specificity and the the reward inherent to this conception can be put aside. It's not at all good that it's just another part of the capitalist world order. What the university might do instead is claim what its name suggests, that insofar as it is universal, which is to say is of and for all, it is a singular place, a universal idea. When I say it's for all, I'm not meaning everyone should go there, rather that its very reason for being is for all. Singularity in this sense might be another possible sense of capstone, perhaps. So yes, one should expect this because this is the imminent and proper trajectory of education, to avoid subjection to privilege, specificity and partiality as the very constitution of its practice. You can have institutions, schools, pedagogy and so on, which are subject to the dictates of church, economy or state, but education, I'm saying, is always that which escapes this determination, and this has been so since Plato invented the academy, despite what the academy says. After all, our nascent academician was accused of the corruption of the youth and impiety for asking questions of that which was ruled without question. By the representatives of the orators and rhetoricians, the men of the law courts and the businessmen, he was condemned on the numbers. As some of you might know, the entrance to the real academy, which was nothing more than a park surrounded by some nice olive trees, a grove, was a stone portico upon which was inscribed, "Let no one enter here who is not a geometer." In a way, I suppose, it was a decorative feature, and indeed such capstones inscriptions were not uncommon. The inscription has been generally not misunderstood to mean that if you don't do mathematics, you can't know nothing, which the mathematicians in the room will know is true. For knowing nothing is what mathematicians like the good impious Socrates do. I say impious rather than impious because it actually is impious. This is for Justin Clemens, who had a big argument apparently with a guy called Peter Horwood over the pronunciation of the word impious. So I put that in just for Justin, but he's not in here. But there is no more to it. Geometry is fundamentally concerned with fair shares. But there is more to it. Geometry is fundamentally concerned with fair shares. Thus what the inscription actually says is, "Let no one enter here who submits to the doctrine of unfair shares." Now that, I would suggest, is to dream large. or as it is today at Australia's premier university, believe. Which is the name, of course, that Justin Bieber uses for his Australian tour and Britney Spears uses for her perfume. I often dream they have the same marketing. So in parentheses, on this topic I want a parenthesis. So I always wonder about these performatives. Like, is the slogan "Dream Large," for example, and every university has one, the outcome of dreaming large? I mean, is the slogan equal to the declaration? I mean, when God said, "Let there be light," there really was light, right? So the performance equal to the declaration, and the declaration was a performance in kind. So I was at a school awards night recently. Platitudes and ideology were rife in the speeches and self-descriptions. It was truly righteous, stupid and ugly. At the end, the president of the school council got up and started banging on about how great it was that this school now, Oh yes, under his watch, of course. Celebrated achievement and excellence. He was glad, he said, they had overcome the politically correct rejection of excellence and rewarding of achievement. It's always funny how they brag about overcoming what's correct. I don't quite understand how that works. Obviously, he had a bee in his tender right wing bonnet. But the thing was that he delivered this paean to excellence in the most unexcellent fashion. It was partial, erratic and confused, inconsistent and poorly delivered. He didn't even have a joke. So, I hope this performative contradiction kept him awake that night, but he looked like the type who sleeps very soundly. The good thing about these sound sleepers is that come the revolution, we can kill them in their beds. End of parenthesis. So thus the correlation between norms and truths is no immediate thing. And if this is what such an institution presumes to know, then its status as educational would need to be questioned. This is not to say one desires no norms, no caps. Rather, it is critical we know what a cap is vis-a-vis that which it caps, that which is not capped and that which is uncappable. Now my Oxford, and Oxford is a place filled with capstones, coping, scribing, pensiums too well heated, to modify Beckett, and a distribution of sense unparalleled in its extension, though enviously copied across the white globe and imposed on the rest, does have an entry for cap, and it does have a sub-entry specific to the university. It says, to put a cap on, confer a degree on. Again, we have room for the play of etymologies. If one attends a graduation ceremony, one wears a cap and a gown. Let's ignore the strange juxtaposition of medieval clerical pageantry and the questionable virtues this pageantry evokes with contemporary neoliberal capitalism, whose logic our educational institutions at their best try to negotiate, and at their worst foster hale and hearty, caps in hand and gowns up around their ears, brokeback style, as we used to say. So anyway, if you can ignore that, or if you can ignore that, and instead note that this cap is called a mortarboard. Sometimes it's called an academical, which is a brilliant word, even if Plato would never have been caught dead in such a thing, even at drinking parties. We can circle back to the stone tablets and the abutments above. Mortar is, of course, what bricklayers and stonemasons used to bind one material body with another, and they carried about on a square board with a handle underneath. Got a picture of that? Yeah. You've all seen that, haven't you? Most brickies I have known, and I've actually known quite a lot, do not wear gowns, despite the fact that building sites are a hive of homoeroticism. It's quite funny too, I think, that this bricklayer's term is used, for can there be a greater distinction in the history of Western civilization than that between head and hand, the intellectual and the manual? And this despite the fact that our Jesus, as Nick Cave put it, was a carpenter by trade, or at least that's what he was told. Is it an act of homage to the worker in stone and wood, or is it an ironical appropriation meant precisely to inscribe the distance between worker and scholar, or to be more Hegelian and so Lacanian about it, slave and master? Or further, is the appropriation of bricks and mortar an attempt to assert against outside hostility and self-doubt that the intellectual house that James built, was solid as a rock, built like a brick shithouse, as the colloquium goes, and not at all a gated community of castles in the air fortified by ivory towers? Sorry to say that as far as these jacks were concerned, Jules didn't much feature. They were her indoors, as the English say, or la bourgeois, as the French worker refers to. Why? The academicians were having none of Plato's sexual comedy. Today we are instructed we live in a post-Jack's world, so there is nothing to see here concerning the place of Jules. So caps worn to graduate, which is the capping of an education, are called mortarboards, and the cap signifies the bond between the gowned body inscribed with the shape of its necessary abutment to come, which is to say, that to which it will have been abutted. But what exactly is capped, and is cap an end? Is it meant to set off the head? And is the inscription worn by the student body set in stone? And is this stone itself set, mortared in place, binding and fossilised? Or is it a rolling stone, a boundary stone, a stepping stone, a cornerstone, a millstone, grindstone, curbstone, touchstone, or do we just get stone? Is it a building block or a stumbling block, to use St Paul's term? directed at Peter, to be short, whose name, as you know, means cornerstone. Derrida's question then, am I serious? Deadly, I suppose. I suppose I'm deadly serious. It's not very serious, is it? I spent 5 years of my life wondering about the truth of education. In brackets, I had marketing opportunity. I'll pass that up. And so if the preeminent institutions of education today claim to cap an education in stone, I want to know what that means. And I'm assuming, given you have to wear it, that you want to too. Let me recount a little anecdote from Plato's dialogue, The Cratylus, for two reasons. One, because it's pertinent, and the other, because I've just mentioned Derrida, Am I Serious, from Limited Ink. You see, Derrida stole that from Plato's Cratylus, which is a dialogue concerning etymologies, meaning and sense, in which Socrates is basically taking the piss out of Cratylus and the entire sophistic tradition for its obsession with words over things. The Sophists, if you don't know, are teachers for money, who, Plato demonstrates, don't know what they profess to know. It's a dangerous word, sophist, and education is a dangerous game. When one tries to turn the world upside down, thus setting it in orientation to truth rather than appearances, the world doesn't like it. If Nietzsche is right and truth is a woman, then obviously turning it upside down without express permission is impolite and rude. For such impudence and impiety, the world will kill you. As you know, Plato was obsessed by the question, what is education? Contrary to the Sophists, Plato thinks that one should begin to think with things and not words. Words to Plato are like a cap. They sit nice and proud and high, but without the thing beneath them holding them up, they fall to the ground bereft and stupid. But this is not to say Plato was a realist or, heaven forbid, today a correlationist. Words are not adequate to things. Things count without words, but that's another story. Anyway, there's a lovely exchange I cannot not recount. As always, Socrates is talking with a youth, a bloke called Hermogenes and a sophistic figure, Cratylus. The conversation is on the proper use of words. Hermogenes says he's been talking with Cratylus, his teacher, to whom all his hex goes. And Cratylus says, and they make a point of talking about the money and how much it costs and so on. And Cratylus says everything has its proper name despite what people agree to call something. Hermogenes says that Cratylus won't explain and asks Socrates if he can. Socrates responds by saying two great things. He says that fine things are hard but worth doing, and then he makes an allusion to one of the most famous and richest of all 5th century sophists, Prodicus. If, like it's supposed about universities, sophists could be ranked, he'd proudly proclaim himself to be in the top 50 or 20 maybe, whatever he thinks he can get away with. Socrates says, if I had taken Prodicus's 500 drachma course, which is a proper course in grammar and understanding, I'd know all about the meaning of names. But as I am poor, I've only had the 1 drachma course, so I don't know the truth of it. Someone wrote a great thesis using that claim about the 1 drachma course. Not very influential it was. Fell stillborn from the press, as Hume said. Of course, given this is Plato, Socrates will come to know the truth of it. He just doesn't know what it is the sophists know about it. And the truth of it will be that one cannot exchange money for education, and that what one gets for one's top dollar may be a chimera, an image or a simulacrum. Not that these don't have their use. After all, in a culture ruled by images, chimera and simulacrum, information about such things is currency, whether it's false coin or not. Deleuze turned this into an ontology. Can I say that? Where's Dr. Rowe? He's not here. Plato says, a wise man follows his guide but is not ignorant of his surroundings. At the same time, this doesn't mean you have to stick your nose in everything. Can one cap education? This is the question. If, as I said, education is that which avoids all institutional determinations, themselves determined, which is not to say that what happens in institutions is of no value and has no educational worth, not at all. Do we reject the law? In the words of St. Paul, hell no. But on the other hand, down with being down by law. Yes, it's this paradoxical articulation again, but so be it. If education is what avoids the state, what is at stake is not having what is education subject to that which education is not. Education is not subject to callous cash payment, to a priori ascriptions as to the useful, the expedient, the appropriate, or the normal. It's not a training up in the ways of the world, as they are. So you might simply join in the ignorant, no less than arrogant, which is not to say unsophisticated, reproduction of the way things are. Yes, we cannot not be included in this, but we only participate in this to the extent that we do not work to avoid reducing what we will be to a seemingly endless sequence of lawful repetitions. Speaking like Socrates messing with Cratylus, or Derrida messing with Saal, to be educated is to not be educated. The former is the work of the corruption that is the latter. If we are to be capped, let it have the status of a mark. Let the mark denote a series of inquiries undertaken. The mark denotes a series, but it does not mark an end. These inquiries are no doubt subject to all kinds of extra educational demands. The demand, for instance, that it not avoid the state or the law. But at the same time, inquiries do insist on such an avoidance, simply because they are inquiries, hypotheses and speculations, organised by a point indiscernible to normal knowledge. This means that what education insists on is the aporetic point over the coping stone and the mortarboard. In shorthand, education insists, it does not consist. The mark then not only marks this set of inquiries undertaken, but importantly is the mark for what will have been. Let me introduce fidelity. What will have been, which is to say, that which is to come, which is not natural, necessary or ordinary, will be entirely conditioned by one's fidelity to this mark. If the capstone is nothing more and nothing less than a mark, then what it marks, future or anterior, is not set in stone, set by what is opposed to it and exploitative of it, but is instead an instance in a trajectory that must take place. The mark is nothing more than a point of orientation, taken and held. It determines no course, prescribes no particular path, but that a path be traced out. It is a demand to be taken up in all its effective power. If one leaves university thinking you have been educated, then one leaves under the sign of the structure to which you have been scribed in advance of you ever having arrived there, and prior to all possible education. If one leaves here thinking that only here can one be educated, then one leaves here enthralled to the ideological gowns and mortar, which geometry already shows to be beneath thought's contempt. You have knowledge, but without truth. To be educated, which is the trajectory and the goal, takes place here, maybe, as well as anywhere, though not everywhere. Indeed, the fundamental contention of all truth and education is truly only by truths. What good and untrue education? Is that it is free and open to all, and this is not because the state sets up schools, but because this capacity is always already equally shared. Who lacks this capacity to be subject? Education is the trace of this equality, the inscription in the world of this justice, and not just us. It is justice and not just us that should constitute our institutions. Paradoxically, this is why institutions, as much as economies and corporations, as much as states, want to corral education, which they recognise precisely as the site of something vital, forceful and effective. They want to corral it to their side and stand as its champion and claim its universality as their own. It's because justice is, despite all appearances to the contrary, a real idea in the world, and everyone every day speculates on the truth of this. However, given the instrumental power of appearances, it is critical to note that one is educated, one is marked, if you like, only when one has been truly corrupted, or to paraphrase Beckett again, when a certain amount of terror has been achieved. That is to say, one is educated insofar as one is corrupted of the corruption which denies that equality insists and that education marks its trace. One is educated when one is corrupted of the corruption which insists that education marks success in the state, moral superiority, the right to rule and to own. Let's cap a stone in that corruption's ass, as the pseudo-gangsters say. Pass through it and fulfil it and go into the world militantly bareheaded or capless. It's a lifelong task to which everyone should undertake to the limit of their strength. Thank you.